So thank you again for joining our FAFSA 101 webinar. If we haven't yet met, my name is May Whiting, and I am the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. We're super excited to have you as we are about to approach the new FAFSA cycle, which starts October 1st. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. They are so important in supporting the work of Alabama Goes to College and making sure that trainings like this are possible. We also have some key partners who are really integral to all of the work that we do, so we want to thank them as well. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times so we can avoid feedback during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/alabamapossible. Throughout the webinar, feel free to submit your questions through the chat feature. Make sure you always select to everyone in the chat when typing in your question or your comment. That way everyone is able to see your question and we can reduce the number of duplicate questions that are asked. So we'll collect all of those questions throughout the webinar and then we will attempt to answer all of them towards the end of the presentation. If there's anything that we don't get to, we will definitely address that one-on-one after the webinar. So we will have some poll questions throughout the webinar. We invite everyone to answer those so that we can get your real-time feedback. And if you are a high school educator who is attending today, then you will need to answer the poll questions in order to receive your professional development credit. So again, if you're a high school educator, make sure you answer those polls so that you stay eligible for your PD hours. All right, if y'all post on social media, we encourage you to tag us in any of your posts. You can find us on social media at AL Goes to College. We definitely love seeing all of the work that you're doing to support your high school seniors. And we also want to be able to support your work and share all the amazing things you're doing. So definitely feel free to tag us and then also use the hashtags that you see below. For posts that are specifically related to financial aid topics, we encourage you to use the hashtags #PelYes, #Fafsa, and #CashForCollege. All right, so I am briefly going to describe the Alabama Goes to College campaign, which is comprised of 3 different components. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, this is a statewide campaign, and it works to ensure that every student can plan for, pursue, and complete valuable post-secondary credentials. So there are 3 components in the campaign. We focus on supporting the completion of the free application for federal student aid through our Cash for College initiative. We also support the college application process through the Alabama College Application Campaign. And then towards the end of the year, we celebrate seniors and their next steps through College and Career Decision Day. So of course, today we are going to be focusing on that first component, Cash for College, which is all about FAFSA completion. So today we are planning to learn what the FAFSA is, why students and families should complete it, what the different types of financial aid are, what steps are included in completing the application and then receiving aid. And then we're also going to talk about how you can promote FAFSA completion and where you can find resources that will support you in further assisting students. So remember, if you have any questions throughout, drop them in the chat and we'll try to address those towards the end. So we're going to start off with a poll. We just want to get an idea of who all is in the room. So these questions are specifically for those of you who are from community-based organizations. So if you are a high school educator who only works in a high school setting, don't respond to these. These are just for the community-based organization representatives. All right, so it's looking like for our community-based organizations, many of you are working with students in a specific geographic area. You're primarily working with students in high school and college. And then the majority of you actually do work directly on high school campuses to support college and career planning events. Awesome. I'm going to end that poll now. Thank you so much for answering. And then we have one more question. We know there's all kinds of comfortability with the FAFSA, so everyone can respond to this next poll that you will see launched. We just want to get an idea of how comfortable you are with the FAFSA right now. Okay, it's looking like the majority are saying somewhat comfortable. So we're kind of right there in the middle. That leaves us a lot of room for learning and growing today. So that's great news. And we will move right along. So we are going to get started with some FAFSA fast facts. Let me go ahead and, okay. So many of you know the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. And it gives students access to the largest source of financial aid for certificates or degrees, whether at 2-year or 4-year programs. And the application is used to determine a student's eligibility for grants, scholarships, work-study jobs, and loans. And we like to emphasize the free aid that the FAFSA provides, because the Pell Grant is an opportunity for students, and it can be used towards education after high school, whether technical or academic programs, and it is free aid or gift aid, which means it does not have to be paid back. And the majority of students in Alabama are eligible for a full or partial Pell Grant. So this includes most high school seniors. The current maximum Pell Grant that a student can receive is $6,895 per year, and that typically increases every year. So this current figure is for the 2022-23 award year. But the main reason that we like to really emphasize the Pell Grant is because Pell and the full amount that a student could receive is more than the average cost of tuition and fees per year at a 2-year college in Alabama. So that's currently estimated to be around $5,048. So the maximum Pell Grant would be greater than that. So it's really important aid that students can access. We also know that completing the FAFSA is strongly associated with positive post-secondary outcomes, including increases in college enrollment, persistence, and attainment. And research shows that 92% of students who complete the FAFSA enroll in post-secondary education the following fall. Completion is also associated with narrowing the enrollment gap across socioeconomic status. So all of this work around FAFSA completion really matters for a few reasons. As of 2021, only 45.7% of the Alabama workforce had a high value credential beyond a high school diploma. And so in order for us to fulfill workforce needs, Alabama needs to add more than 500,000 highly skilled workers with valuable credentials by 2025. So we're just a few years out from this goal date. But less than half of the class of 2021 had completed a FAFSA by the end of May 2021. So that means that that class forfeited millions of dollars of free federal aid that was available to support their post-secondary pursuits. And because FAFSA completion in Alabama is usually quite low compared to other states, many of you know the State Board of Education passed a policy that completing the FAFSA would become part of the high school graduation checklist. So starting with the class of 2022, it was the first senior class that was required to either complete a FAFSA or complete an opt-out waiver. And we saw a significant improvement in FAFSA completion last year. So we greatly appreciate that all of y'all are here today to support this class of 2023. So just to reiterate, FAFSA completion is a key step in pursuing and affording post-secondary education. So if we're going to increase the number of people in the workforce with valuable credentials, we need to ensure that they know their financial aid resources and that they access those so they can afford college. So just to recap again, the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It is what is used to determine the aid that students are eligible to receive. And you used to be able to complete it at fafsa.gov or the My Student Aid app, but we can go ahead and cross out the My Student Aid app because that is being retired this year. So now you can access the online application at fafsa.gov, or if a student needs to do a paper application, they still have that available to them. But the app is no longer in use. So we'll talk a little bit about how aid is calculated, just so you can get an idea of what the FAFSA is being used for. So aid is calculated through the following formula. You start off with cost of attendance. Cost of attendance is determined by the actual institution. So it's going to include things like the total cost of tuition, books, and room and board for the year. Then from that, we subtract expected family contribution, or EFC, which takes into account things like family income, assets, benefits, family size, and then the number of family members attending college. And it's important to clarify that EFC is not actually the amount of money that a family will have to pay for college. It is an index number that just gauges how much a family could contribute, but it's not exactly what the family's going to contribute. So when you subtract out EFC from cost of attendance, you determine the student's financial need and how much need-based aid that they will qualify for. So I want to note right here, just so it will be on your radar, this year's FAFSA is the last FAFSA that will be using EFC. Next year, we'll start FAFSA simplification, and EFC is going to be replaced by a new index. So stay tuned for our trainings next year, because we'll essentially be relearning everything that we've gone over this year. All right, so we have four main types of financial aid. I'm going to summarize these fairly quickly. But the reason that we talk about these specifically is because a lot of people will assume that completing the FAFSA is only done to determine federal grants and federal loans, but that's definitely not the case. There are other kinds of aid that it opens the door to as well. So grants are gift aid. They don't have to be paid back. So one example is the Pell Grant. Scholarships are also gift aid, and they can be awarded for just about anything. So academics, athletics, volunteer work. Work study is a part-time job opportunity. These are often on campus, and they help cover the cost of college. And then loans are borrowed money that must be paid back with interest. So many times, and this is important to stress to your students, the FAFSA is actually used or required to determine non-federal grants and non-federal scholarships. So something like a grant directly from the college, or something like a scholarship directly from a foundation. So the FAFSA is way more than just an application used to determine federal aid. So while the FAFSA is more than just an application for federal aid, there are some specific types of federal aid that we want to mention here. These are things that students might be eligible for. So we have grants that are based completely on financial need. We have grants based on family circumstances. And then we also have grants that are based on career aspirations or commitment. And then we have several different types of federal loans. Of course, students should be aware of their terms and conditions. And then there are a few other types of aid that will depend on your circumstances, like whether you're studying internationally or whether you're part of a military family. So all of these different types of aid are linked so that you can read more about them when we send out the slides after the webinar. Okay, so financial aid uses. Financial aid can be used towards expenses such as tuition and fees, books and supplies, transportation, childcare for dependents, and room and board. So lots of different things that this aid can go towards. We want to spend a little bit of time talking about key messages for students. We're always trying to correct misinformation and educate students with messages like this. The FAFSA is completely free. You shouldn't be paying a single penny for the application. There are some scam sites out there who will try to get a student to pay. The FAFSA is for technical and professional certificates as well as academic degrees. A student may be eligible for up to $6,895 per year in Pell Grant aid. And then many non-federal grants and scholarships actually do require a FAFSA. Early completion beginning October 1st is very important, and you'll see why as we go through these slides. And then we really encourage students to be aware of scholarship and FAFSA priority deadlines at whatever college they're applying to. So we also have some key messages for the families of students. We're trying to educate parents and caregivers that the FAFSA is safe and secure using fafsa.gov. It is only used to determine your student's eligibility for financial aid and absolutely nothing else. Your student will need your help to get key information from you so they can complete the application. Completing the app, the sooner the better. It will give you better chances to receive various types of aid. And then lastly, and this is a big one, even if you think your family does not qualify for federal aid, it's really good to have a FAFSA on file should your circumstances change, but also for all the other reasons we already mentioned, like the FAFSA is used to determine private scholarships and things like that. So you don't want to turn down aid opportunities. Absolutely everyone, regardless of income, should be completing a FAFSA. So in our toolkit, which we have available on Google Drive, we have some email templates that can be used to communicate some of these key messages to families. So we'll make sure y'all have the link to our toolkit, which has a bunch of sample emails and texts for y'all. We are going to dive on in to FAFSA eligibility requirements, starting off with the student eligibility. So to be fully eligible to accept federal aid, students must be a US citizen, US national, or eligible non-citizen. And we'll talk more about this on the next slide. They must also have a valid social security number. There are some exceptions to this. And then they need a high school diploma or a GED certificate if they didn't complete an approved homeschool education, or if they didn't enroll in an eligible career pathway program. So they need to have that proof that they've completed their high school education. They must be enrolled or accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. And then while they're actually in college, they will need to maintain satisfactory academic progress, and that will be defined by the institution they're attending. So in order for them to keep their federal aid eligibility, they have to meet their institution's requirements. And lastly, they will have to sign certifying statements on the FAFSA. Basically, these are statements that say, I'm not in default on a federal student loan, I don't owe money on a federal student grant, and I'm only going to use this aid for educational purposes. So to elaborate on that first bullet point, if a student is not a US citizen or not a US national, they must be an eligible non-citizen. So they have to provide documentation like a green card. So one of these forms that shows they're a US permanent resident. They can also show an arrival departure record if they are a refugee, an asylee, or other type of immigrant. They can show a T visa or that they have a parent with a T1 visa. This is for victims of human trafficking. If they can show they have battered immigrant status for victims of abuse. And then if they have citizenship from the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or the Republic of Palau. So with this last bullet point, those folks are only eligible for certain types of aid. And then right below that, even if an immigrant student does not have one of these records, they might still complete the FAFSA as a record of family need. So they might not be eligible for federal aid, but they might still complete a FAFSA to determine eligibility for either state or private aid. So a little more on other immigration statuses. If a student is undocumented or has been granted deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, they are not going to be eligible for federal aid currently. So DACA is an immigration policy that allows some individuals who are brought to the country as children to receive a renewable deferred action from deportation, and then also to become eligible for a work permit in the US. And currently, folks under DACA are not eligible for federal aid, but they might have a social security number, meaning they can still complete a FAFSA to determine eligibility for state and institutional aid. And then we think it's worth mentioning that the current administration has proposed expanding federal aid eligibility to include DACA recipients. And if that passes, we will definitely keep you informed. So this is student eligibility. So now you know, what does it take for a student to be considered eligible for federal aid? And now we're going to actually talk about completing these steps of the FAFSA. So starting off with the general FAFSA cycle. There is a new cycle every year, and there's often a little bit of confusion about which FAFSA a student needs to complete. So the FAFSA application is named after the year the aid is awarded. So the 2023-24 FAFSA is used to apply for financial aid for fall semester 2023 through summer semester 2024. So your high school seniors will be applying with this 2023-24 FAFSA application, because that will be the year that they first start post-secondary education. In some instances, if a high school senior begins college the summer after their high school graduation, so maybe June, right after graduating in May, in some instances, they might actually need to complete the 2022-23 FAFSA. So whenever you have a student who is going to attend summer courses, it's really recommended to reach out to the college's financial aid office and ask, hey, which FAFSA should I complete? Because they might need to complete both of these FAFSAs to determine summer aid eligibility and then fall aid eligibility. So here's an overview of the steps that students will need to complete. Steps 1 and 2 are interchangeable. They can be done way in advance of October 1st. So next week would be a great time to start getting this ready so that Once October 1st rolls around, students can really focus on steps 3 through 7, but we're going to go through each of these now. So step 1, documents. So it can save time and also really ensure accuracy if students have the necessary paperwork with them when they're starting the application. So what is required is a social security number of the student, an alien registration number of student if they are not a US citizen, dates of birth for the student and the parent. That is, of course, only if the student is actually a dependent for FAFSA purposes. That's when they'll need to provide parent information. And then you might notice we have parents in quotation marks. That's because we are referring to a parent as defined by federal student aid. And that's often not what people are thinking about when they're just thinking about a caretaker. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about that definition. So if the student is a dependent, they'll need to provide the parent's social security number. They're gonna need the prior year tax returns. So that means they're going to need the 2021 tax returns for the 2023-2024 FAFSA cycle. They will also need records of untaxed income like child support or veterans non-education benefits. And then they'll need records of benefits like Medicaid, SSI, SNAP, and TANF. And then they could also need information on their cash on hand, their savings and checking account balances, as well as investments in real estate assets that are not including the home. So we often hear from folks that it's really hard to get parents to provide this information. We understand that can be a huge barrier. And so that's why we think it's so important to start messaging now as early as possible so that families have time to prepare all of these documents that are required from them. And then we also recommend a tactic that an educator in Alabama had told us in the last few years. Around the time of tax season, she sends out texts to all of her families saying, hey, we know you're filing your taxes now. Don't forget to make a copy of your tax forms and have them on hand next October for her seniors. So I think that's a great idea if you're working with families year round. All right, step 2, we have creating the FSA ID. So like I mentioned, this can be done well in advance of October 1st, and you can do it at fafsa.gov. Essentially, the FSA ID is a username and password for all things federal student aid. A lot of y'all do a great job of introducing the FSA ID when students are juniors so that they're ready with it by the time October 1st comes. And we always recommend doing it in advance because it can take sometimes 3 days for the ID to be verified or confirmed. And so you never want to host a FAFSA workshop where students are just beginning to create their FSA ID with the expectation that they'll also do their application, because sometimes you have to have a waiting period in between the two. Generally, I think FSA IDs are being approved a lot more quickly these days, but we just wanted to give a heads up that you could have this waiting period for it to be approved. Now, both the student and the parent should create an FSA ID unless the student is considered independent under federal guidelines. That FSA ID, it's not only a username and password, it also serves as an electronic signature when the student is submitting their FAFSA. And then if a student is a dependent, but their parent doesn't have a social security number, unfortunately, that parent will not be able to create an FSA ID, but they still can sign and print the FAFSA and then submit the FAFSA by mail. So it will take a little bit longer, but they'll still be able to get everything submitted. So again, we encourage y'all to get that started early. And then we also want to make sure folks know that they should be using a personal email address when they're creating their FSA ID. So you never want to use a work or a school email address that you'll only have temporarily. You want to have a permanent personal email address that you associate with this account. And then we see this so often, but students and their parents should have totally separate FSA IDs with totally separate email addresses associated and totally separate phone numbers associated. If you're mixing the email addresses or the phone numbers, it will create a lot of headaches throughout the FAFSA process. So we have a how to create an FSA ID worksheet in our toolkit. It guides you through the process. And there's new advice, which the arrow is pointing to, which is to not use a brand new option that FSA is offered, which is the option for personal identifiers. So I will show you all that up close on the next slide. So basically, when you're starting a FAFSA, you're going to be presented with a few options. If you already have an FSA ID, you can click log in to continue, and you can type your username and password. If you're creating an FSA ID for the first time, you'll make that second selection. But they also added this new option to use personal identifiers to access the FAFSA. We absolutely encourage you to not have students do this. There's so many reasons why. It allows students easy access to start the FAFSA, but then the student mistakenly thinks that because they've entered in their personal information, that they've created an FSA ID by doing so. And that is not the case. They actually have to go through the process of creating an FSA ID in order to have that ready. And having that ready is absolutely critical to being able to electronically sign the FAFSA once you've filled out the entire application. So this often feels like the easiest option and a shortcut to starting the application, but I promise you it will cause so many headaches down the line, so do not use this option. We saw a lot of trouble with it last year. Okay, so now we're getting into the actual application, and it is comprised of several sections, which many of you know. So we're going to go through each of them now. But before we do that, I wanted to mention that there is a demo system. We'll send a link out to this when we send our follow-up email. On the demo system, you can practice FAFSA scenarios. So you can basically practice the 2023-24 FAFSA. And it has all the same features of an actual application on FAFSA on the web, except that no data is actually processed. So this demo system will be available this upcoming Sunday. So if you're looking for a way to get comfortable with FAFSA completion, this is a great tool. Okay, so when we're in the actual application, there are a few key updates that are specific to this new FAFSA cycle. One is that eligibility for federal aid is not tied to drug convictions or to male students registering for the selective service. So these questions were asked in the past, but they've been completely removed from the application starting this year. Another key update is that a demographic survey has been added. So before signing the FAFSA, the student will complete this survey. And if they do not want to provide their demographic info, they certainly don't have to. They can just select the decline to answer option. But I wanted to point that out in case you notice that at the very end, you're seeing this new survey you've never seen before. But we do put actual student demographic information that's more just basic contact information into the very first section of the application. So the student will put their name entered exactly as it appears on their Social Security card. And they will also put in their number exactly seen on that card as well. If the student has a driver's license, it is helpful to add that driver's license information just to verify their identity, but they are not required to provide that information. So it will allow you to skip that question. And then the student is asked if they're interested in being considered for work study. And students should always put yes to this, even if they later decline any work study that is offered to them, just because it gives them the option down the road to have that extra source of funding. After they put in their basic demographic information, they will get to school selection. They have to put at least one school. We encourage every student to put at least a local college or university. And in Alabama, it doesn't matter at all what order you put your schools in. They don't need to list a state school first for state aid eligibility. That is the case in some states, but not in Alabama. When they are selecting the schools that they want to receive their information, they can search by school name or the school location, or they can also use the school federal code if they happen to know that. And then they can add up to 10 schools on the initial application. And then after submitting, they can log in and add additional schools. And we will show you how to do that in a moment. So after school section, we get to dependency status. And this is one of the most important parts of the FAFSA application. And it's what is often gotten incorrect most often. So we really want to hammer this home. Dependency status is such a critical part of the application because it will really inform what information is provided. And if it's not provided correctly, what the student will have to do to follow up with their college to correct all this information. So the application will actually walk the student through a series of questions to determine if they're dependent or independent. And most students are considered dependent students for the purposes of FAFSA. So most students are required to provide parent information. Now, independent students do not require a parent to complete the FAFSA, but they may require further documentation to actually verify their independent status because it is so rare that a student is an independent student. So we have linked a couple resources here. One is a dependency questionnaire. So that helps you determine whether you're a dependent. And then if you are a dependent, we have the Who's My Parent flowchart to determine who is actually considered your parent for the purposes of FAFSA. And we have those in both English and Spanish. So in order to determine dependency status, you'll use that questionnaire, and we'll look at it in just a minute. But if the student answers yes to any of the questions, they are considered independent, meaning they do not have to provide parent info. If the student answers no to all of the questions on the questionnaire, they're considered dependent, and then they do have to provide parent info. So here's the form. They have not yet released the 2023-24 form, so this will be updated to have current dates and all the more relevant information. But this is last year's dependency questionnaire. So you're going to go through each of the questions, and then if you answer no to all of them, then you are a dependent and you will provide parent info. So let's say we've gone through that and we have said no to every single question. So we are a dependent. Then we need to figure out, okay, who is considered my parent for the purposes of the FAFSA? So again, a dependent student will have to determine who their parent is, and then they will provide that parent's financial information. For independent students, they will only report their student financial information. So for parent determination, for dependent students, we have the Who's My Parent flowchart. And this is what it looks like. So we will just go through this really quickly. Basically, you're going to follow the chart to answer each question, starting off with, are your parents married to each other? If yes, report information for both parents on the Fafsa. If no, they're not married to each other, then it asks, do your parents live together? If yes, then report information for both parents on the Fafsa, even if they were never married, are divorced, or are separated. So if they live together, report both their information. If they do not live together, then it's going to ask, did you live with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? If yes, I lived with my father for 9 months out of the year, then I'm going to report my father's information on the Fafsa because I lived with him more throughout the year. But if I answer no because I lived with both of my parents equally, then I'm going to report information on the Fafsa for the parent who provided more financial support over the past 12 months, or in the last year that I received support from them. So it's first going to ask, who did I live with more? And then it'll be whoever I lived with more. If I lived with my parents equally, then who provided the most support? And then when we figure out who provided the most support, you'll make sure you ask, has this parent remarried? And if yes, you want to report step-parent information. If no, then you just report that one parent's information. And then this is the most important part down here. We see it gotten wrong all of the time. These people are never, ever a parent for Fafsa purposes unless they legally adopted the student. So that includes a widowed step-parent, grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, older brothers or sisters, aunts or uncles. None of these are a parent for Fafsa purposes unless they've legally adopted the student. So only a parent will be listed as the parent on the Fafsa unless there's adoption situations. And we know that that does not really serve students who have all kinds of living situations. And we know that can make it incredibly difficult to obtain the financial information that the Fafsa asks for. But we know it's a lot more of a headache for a student to list the wrong person as their Fafsa, and then for the college to inquire about why they list that person and have to do a lot of follow-up with the college to rectify the situation. So always make sure you're going through these questions thoroughly with the student. And if you have trouble obtaining information from the parent because that student doesn't actually live with their parents, we're happy to talk more about it. And we also have a few slides coming up that will talk about that at length. So what if the student doesn't live with their parent? And what if the student doesn't have contact with their parents? So in these circumstances, a dependent student can submit the Fafsa without parent information if any of the following applies. So if their parents are incarcerated, if they have left the home due to an abusive family environment, if they do not know where their parents are or are unable to contact them and they have not been adopted, or if they're older than 21 but not yet 24, are unaccompanied, and are either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So if any of these applies, the student can submit the Fafsa without parent information. These are considered special circumstances. And you will see this option on the actual application. If a dependent did not submit parent information due to any of those circumstances, their application won't be processed until they take the following actions. They need to immediately contact the financial aid office. They'll have to gather required evidence and documentation of their situation. And then after that, they'll receive an EFC and a financial aid package based on whatever determination the school makes. So then there are some other circumstances that you might encounter that are not considered special circumstances. One might be that the student has contact with their parent, but their parent refuses to provide information. This happens frequently, and hopefully you can get through to that parent and show them why they need to provide it. But if you can't, the student can still submit their FAFSA without the parent information. They won't be able to get any federal student aid other than an unsubsidized loan. And even then, that's not guaranteed. It's a decision totally up to the financial aid office at the school that they are planning to attend. And then another circumstance you might encounter is if the student is a citizen themselves, but they have parents who are undocumented and don't have a social security number. So it's important to know and reiterate that a parent's citizenship status does not affect a student's eligibility for federal student aid. So the FAFSA is never going to ask about a parent's citizenship status. So since that parent doesn't have a social, you will enter all zeros for the parent's social security number on the FAFSA form. And because they're not going to be able to create an FSA ID without their social, they'll have to print and mail the signature page instead of doing the electronic signature option. And we want to mention, because there are millions of undocumented immigrants who file taxes annually, they do have something called an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number, and that number allows them to file taxes, but that number should never be put in the place of the social security number on the FAFSA. It should always just be all zeros if that person does not have a social security number. So after you've done the student information and you have moved on to parent demographics, you'll be inputting the parent's marital status, including the month and year that they were married or remarried, separated, divorced, or widowed. And then also in parent demographics, you'll be putting the number of dependents of the parent and the number of college students in the parent's household. When you get to the financial section, it will ask you the type of tax return filed, if any. So there's also the option to say will file or not filed. And then after, if they have filed, you'll also indicate the tax filing status. Now, one of the tools that is critical to making the FAFSA a lot less work for you is the IRS data retrieval tool. It is going to allow you to securely and accurately transfer tax information directly onto the FAFSA. The only trick is that in order for you to get all of that pulled through to the FAFSA, you're going to have to enter in the correct address information that was on the tax return for that year. So for this FAFSA cycle, we're looking at 2021 taxes. If they have those on hand in front of them, just look at the address that they've put on their return and then make sure that it is entered exactly as you see it into the data retrieval tool, or the DRT. So unfortunately, not everyone can use the DRT. These are the people who are not eligible to use it. So students or parents who are married and filed as married filing separately, are married and filed as head of household, or filed a Puerto Rican or foreign tax return. All of these folks are going to need to enter their tax return information manually, but everyone else should really try as hard as possible to use the DRT so that there's less room for error. Like we had mentioned several times, the FAFSA uses prior year tax information, meaning taxes from 2 years before the award year. So that means, of course, families can complete their FAFSA without any delay. So for the 2023-24 FAFSA, families are using that 2021 tax return that they filed just this beginning of 2022 year. And because there's a lot of concern about how this tax information is used, we hope that you will continue the messaging that this income information is only used to determine need-based aid that the student is eligible to receive. It's not being used for any other reason. Other than tax information, there's a bunch of other financial info that has to be provided. So the FAFSA will ask if any of these benefits were received: Medicaid or supplemental security income, supplemental nutrition assistance, free or reduced price lunch, temporary assistance for needy families, and then special supplemental nutrition for women, infants, and children. And then there are untaxed income and assets that are asked for on the FAFSA, including child support, veterans non-education benefits, workers' compensation, disability benefits. For all of these questions, the FAFSA is going to give extremely detailed explanations of what it is looking for. So there will be a little icon that you can click for more information by every single question, and it will define these terms super explicitly. So if you're not exactly sure, or if the family's not even sure if they have these, they can read more about each of these on the application. And then for some people, just depending on where their income is falling, for some people, they will be asked about information about their cash on hand, their savings and checking account balances, investments, and real estate assets. You'll notice that for lots of folks, they're able to completely skip this section, and that is very purposeful. The FAFSA does have skip logic, and they're more than welcome to skip that. The FAFSA is basically signaling, it doesn't look like we need this information from you. So just go ahead and skip there. With the student financials, they're being asked the same questions: the type of return that was filed, if any, and then the tax filing status. I do think a lot of folks are a bit confused about when students need to file taxes. So if y'all ever have any questions around that, feel free to refer them to us. I've seen quite often that they said, oh, my student doesn't need to file taxes, and there's been a misunderstanding of the student threshold for filing. So after we get through each section of the FAFSA, we get to the point where we're ready to sign and submit. Both the child and the parent must sign using their Fsa Id if they're submitting electronically. But like I mentioned, some folks can't submit electronically. In that case, they can still print their application, sign, and mail. Of course, we're always going to encourage those who can to actually do the electronic submission because it's much faster. They'll get their student aid report a lot quicker that way. But if a student has a parent, who doesn't have a social security number, who can't create an Fsa Id, there's still that option to print. So after submitting the FAFSA, what's next? It will take about 3 to 5 business days for the Department of Education to process it. And then the student will receive their student aid report when the results are ready. And we always encourage folks to regularly check whatever email is associated with their Fsa Id, so that they can check that inbox regularly, see when they get their SAR, and then review it carefully and make any corrections that are needed. The financial aid office, to whatever school the student has applied, will let the student know if any information is needed. So one thing that's commonly misunderstood is that when the student has submitted their FAFSA and federal student aid has processed it, at that point, federal student aid kind of takes hands off. They say, all right, this is now the business of all the colleges and universities where the student has applied. And so at that point, the student wouldn't really necessarily be doing much with federal student aid, they would be doing a lot of follow-up with their actual college where they're planning to enroll. So again, you might get notice from the financial aid office saying, hey, we got your financial information. We would like to see this extra documentation just to confirm things. So before we go into our next sections, I think we're going to take a little breather. We're almost through the bulk of the training, but I'm going to have about a minute for folks to get water, get any food if they need.
Good afternoon. We have Sean Stevens from the Alabama State Department of Education, and he'll be addressing you all. Sean, all yours.
Well, hey there, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for just the opportunity to just spend a few moments with you, and either first congratulate everyone on all the success that you've already had and what we will have as far as helping students complete FAFSA and finance their futures, but then also all the work that we're doing just with students and their families in general about college admissions and again removing barriers to post-secondary education. So I'm just glad I get to be a part of this. You know, when we think about this year compared to last year, we kind of have a baseline, a metric of how many students in Alabama really are pursuing post-secondary education and how many of them, you know, really needed that extra push, that extra ask, that extra resource, that extra everything from last year. You know, it all paid off, and I think it's amazing to know that Alabama's ninth in the country, right, for FAFSA completion, and second with increase in completion from year to year, and that's only because of the work that you're doing in the schools, and only because of the work that with our partners such as Alabama Possible and so many others who truly live their mission and how they help support us. So that's I'm glad I get to be part of this.
Thank you, Sean. May, all yours.
So step 5 is the student aid report. Students are going to want to check their email for their SAR, or if they didn't provide an email address, then they'll receive the student aid report by mail. This takes anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, kind of depending on what the student has given when completing the application. They'll want to check the SAR for accuracy and make any corrections. They'll also want to check for the expected family contribution, or EFC, because if the EFC is missing, then it means the FAFSA is incomplete. So on the student aid report, there might be a note that some information either has to be corrected or has to be confirmed if the student is selected for verification. So it's always important that the student does a very thorough check of that student aid report. Here's an example of a student aid report. So it says the date the application was received and the date it was processed. And then you see that it gives an expected family contribution number. So it looks like the student has provided information to be able to determine their aid eligibility. So if the student hasn't gotten an email, they can always log into their federal student aid account and try to pull up their student aid report through that. This is on their FAFSA homepage. There is another option that students have after completing their FAFSA. That is that they can go back in, they can log back in, and rather than going into the actual application, they can just go to their homepage, and down at the bottom, they find the section for updating school information. And this allows them to either add colleges that they want to have receive their financial information or update their list of colleges. So if a student wasn't intending to apply to a certain college, but then they decide to do so, they can go back to their FAFSA and add that school's information so that the school is actually getting their financial data. Now, we mentioned verification, and this is a process that consists of making corrections and providing additional information. This is all totally normal. It does not mean that the student is in any kind of trouble at all. But what we want to mention is that the verification process does really vary by each school. So it's important to follow the process that the college or university gives directly to the student, because they'll have different forms and different ways of confirming information. And the financial aid offices at each college are really helpful in showing students what needs to be provided. Some really promising information is that the Department of Education recognizes verification has been a burden to students. And so over the years, they've slowly reduced the instances and the reasons for verification. And we certainly expect to see that trend this year as well. So I'm going to do a little check-in with a poll and see if we all remember which tax return is needed for the 2023-24 FAFSA. All right, most of you got that one right. It is 2021, so it's the prior year. So if we're looking at 2023 as the award year, 2 years back, we're looking at 2021 as the tax year. Thank y'all. Okay, step 7 are our award letters. Each college that accepts the student will send the financial aid award letter. This might come via email. And for the school that the student wants to attend, they'll need to either accept or decline each type of aid. And so that's very important. There will be often multiple types of aid listed, and the student will have to either accept or decline each single one. We always recommend accepting aid in the following order. So free money first, scholarships and grants, and then earned money that the student works for with part-time employment through work study, and then borrowed money last, so federal student loans. Now, if there are concerns about what the student might be awarded, so for instance, we have this question here, what if the financial situation of the student and their family change significantly because of financial hardships or unemployment? So say a student, they are required to use their 2021 tax information, which is reflecting the 2021 calendar year. But say in January of 2022, someone got laid off or they're unemployed for a number of reasons. If they're thinking, okay, my 2021 tax information is not reflective of my current financial situation, the student can proactively communicate that to the financial aid office of their college immediately after they complete the FAFSA. So long before they receive their award letter, they can proactively reach out and say, hey, you'll receive my information, but it doesn't totally reflect my current situation. We do recommend that, especially if the financial situation has changed drastically. Now, say the student receives their financial aid award, but it still doesn't reflect their financial need. They have an opportunity to appeal their award directly to the college, and they'll often have to provide certain documents to basically prove why they're appealing. But colleges are able to use professional judgment to adjust information on the FAFSA, which could impact the student's EFC and their grant eligibility. And there are all kinds of templates that are available on Swift Student, which you'll have linked in the slides when we send them out. So we've gone through almost everything. I'm just going to highlight some common mistakes that we see so that you can know to avoid them. The first being using the wrong person as the FAFSA parent. You're not going to want to use a grandparent, an aunt, or an uncle, unless that person has legally adopted the student. Using the incorrect website, so anything that's going to charge the student money, not 100% completing the FAFSA. So this is really important. Sometimes the student will get all the way through their application and think, okay, I've filled out everything, but they forget to press submit. So they haven't gotten all the way through. And then another way this can happen is they have gotten all the way through submission. They see their congratulations screen, but they don't monitor their email account to see if there's any further follow-up tasks that need to happen. So that could be indicated on their SAR, or it could be something they learn from the college they've applied to, like, hey, you need to do these extra tasks. Other mistakes like inputting incorrect information. only listing one college on their FAFSA or forgetting to add the additional schools where they applied. Not using the data retrieval tool when the student is actually eligible to do so. Not reading definitions carefully. So again, everything is very explicitly laid out in the application. Not signing the FAFSA. Another thing we see related to signing is that the student will sign the FAFSA, but their parent won't. So the student says, hey, I've done everything I need to. The parent hasn't completed their portion. So ultimately, the student's FAFSA is not going to be processed. You need the student to submit the FAFSA within 45 days of starting it. Otherwise, their information might get wiped from the application. Of course, that student needs to pay attention to any deadline that a college or university has for FAFSA priority and for scholarship priority. And then a big mistake would be waiting until graduation or after graduation to complete the FAFSA. We know students need to either complete the FAFSA or complete an opt-out waiver so that everything is accountable for the purposes of the graduation checklist. So a few strategies that we recommend, if you're a community-based organization, we really recommend you collaborate directly with high schools that are in your service area. So whether that means hosting on-campus workshops or offering your space for off-campus workshops. And we highly recommend developing close relationships with the counselors and career coaches at those schools. Communicating through multiple channels like email, social media, your website, text, things like Remind or Signalvine. All of these are good ways to reach families, and we have templates for the language that you can send. And then ultimately, we recommend conveying the benefits of completing the FAFSA early on so that they have all of this time where they can do any follow-up tasks. And they're making sure that they're meeting priority deadlines. And where you can, providing incentives is always helpful. We've seen a lot of unique strategies that educators have employed in that regard. So some resources that you'll have linked when we send you the slides. Today, actually at 1 p.m., there will be a FAFSA webinar provided by Federal Student Aid. They're going to go over some of the updates that I mentioned. Of course, FAFSA.gov covers just about every single scenario you can think of, but we are also happy to be a resource whenever you have complicated scenarios. The financial aid toolkit that is provided by FSA is really great if you're looking for printable resources or video resources to send out to families. And then their hotline is generally very good. It might require some hold time, but usually their representatives are very helpful. So I've been referencing our toolkit, which we have on Google Drive, and it's available at the link you see on the screen. And then you'll want to go into the Cash for College folder to find all the financial aid related resources. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that partnering with financial aid offices at local colleges is one of the best things you can do as a community organization. Their representatives are so willing to come out to your space and to volunteer at any of your events. So I also recommend developing partnerships with them. We have a help desk. This is a phone number that students, families, community leaders, educators can all text or call. It's 334-316-6155. We would be happy to set up one-on-one appointments with you, especially for super complicated FAFSAs. So don't hesitate to use that. And then now we're going to take a moment for your question. If I don't get to anything specifically, we will definitely follow up with you one-on-one.
All right. Before I start the questions, Mr. Stevens from State Department, he put this in chat, and I don't know if you all have seen that or not, so I wanted to read it. For some reason, he got disconnected. The FAFSA non-participation waiver for the senior class of 2023 will be available on October 1st. we will be sure to send it directly to school principals and other school leaders. So counselors and the career coaches will have those waivers. But we do have a few questions. So the first one is, what is going to happen in a few years when federal government does away with the credit for multiple kids in college? Will Pell Grant increase and will income threshold increase?
There have been a lot of national organizations that have been looking at how this will play out and how it will affect students and their aid eligibility. So I think they've done some predictive modeling around it. I would be happy to send along those resources that I have available in the follow-up email. I can't speak to it in detail because it's all somewhat hypothetical right now, like the direct impact it will have, but I'll send that in the follow-up email.
The second one was, sorry, I missed, where can we get the demo to do a run of the Fafsa on Sunday?
Yeah, so it opens on Sunday. So right now you can only access the 2022-23 Fafsa demo, but the 2023-24 will be available this Sunday. It will be in the follow-up email, but I will also drop the link in the chat too.
Next one, under the special circumstance, would the student be considered independent?
So I believe the student will, so special circumstances is defined very specifically. So it is the 4 different things, and I'll share my screen so that we're all on the same page. 4 different situations where a student is a dependent, but they can submit the FAFSA without parent information. So essentially, they're being allowed to be independent, but they are technically considered a dependent with special circumstances.
Next question is, and the name needs to be exact. Say someone got married in a year after filing taxes, use the name on the tax return.
So there are 2 different things. For the name that is on the application in the basic information section, that name you want to be exactly matching the Social Security card. So if someone has gotten married, but they didn't get their Social Security card information updated, they're going to use whatever they have on their card because you're matching the information to the Social Security Administration. With the tax return, when you're using the IRS data retrieval tool, it will ask for all of these fields to be completed. I think it includes name, mailing address. You'll want to enter in the name and the mailing address as seen on the tax return for that section.
So next question. Is the question for who did the student live with more, which year? The tax year 2021 or the current calendar year?
Yes, I understand why that is confusing. So I'm going to share my screen again. So when you're determining the parent, it's asking you, did you live with one or more parents, or with one parent more than the other over the past 12 months? So whatever date you're doing the FAFSA, the 12 months before that date. And then for the financial question, it's a little bit different. It's asking who provided more financial support over the past 12 months or in the last year you received support. So that could be potentially years ago, but whatever was the last year you actually got support.
The next one, what is the threshold for filing taxes for students?
Yes, that is actually dependent on a lot of factors. So there's a chart that I will drop in the chat addressing that. It's going to be a tax guide and I'll give you the specific page number.
How long does it take for the student to receive a student aid report? Also, how long does it take the student's FAFSA completion to be reflected on the AIC portal?
Okay, I will answer the first one in the chat right now. So for receiving the student aid report, It totally depends on how the student submitted, whether they provided an email address. So this website breaks it down based on whatever the student did, but it can be anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on what they did. How long does it take to show up in the AIC portal?
That's right.
So it will depend. I'm hesitant to answer this concretely because it really depends on the student situation, because they might have some things preventing it from going to the AIC portal. But the Alabama Commission on Higher Education gets FAFSA data on a daily basis. So they're updating the portal every single day with new information. So the turnaround should be quick, assuming that the student doesn't have any issues with their application. I can't quite answer that question concretely.
The next question, how long do you recommend deleting a school before adding a new school to make sure the school has received the FAFSA before deleting it?
Admittedly, I do not know the answer to this question, so I'm going to follow up and find out the answer. Hopefully the review today gave you a little bit more confidence with the FAFSA. I wanted to mention that we are also planning to have an advanced FAFSA training. That training really gets into kind of the ins and outs of complicated scenarios. So if you have questions about super complicated family circumstances or living situations, we'll make sure to email y'all the date and time of that training too. So for educators, high school educators who are joining us, you can claim your professional development at this link, which will take you to PowerSchool. And then the codes for this course are 295839, and then section number 454809. And our code, we can also include that in the follow-up email. The last thing I have, if y'all want to ask questions in the chat, is just the way you can contact us. Again, we have our help desk line. That phone number is listed there. You can always email us questions too. So definitely stay connected and stay in touch. We really appreciate y'all being here today, especially for so long. I'll try to get everything out to you in the follow-up email. Thank you all so much for being here. If you have to head on your way, I hope you have a good Friday and a good weekend.